Do you remember back in the early days of the internet when people were just beginning to understand its promise? People being so excited and so optimistic about what was going to happen when people around the world all had access to all this information. We would be so wise, so smart. We wouldn't have to rely on different people that filter information for us. We'd have access to it all. We'd be so spiritually advanced because we could have access to all this information. You didn't have to go to seminary to get it. You could go, anyone could access it. Well, that hasn't worked out so well. I mean, what's happening now? What are we doing with this? We're watching cat videos. We're reading conspiracy theories. We're joining things like the Flat Earth Society. What's happening here? It's like instead of making us smarter, access to all this information is just making us more stupid. Instead of making us wiser and more discerning, it just makes us more gullible. Or at least some of us more gullible. What's going on? Well, it turns out there is a very distinctive skill, an important skill that separates people, the people who do well in navigating the variety and the barrage of information that we have available to us, and the people who don't, the people who struggle. And this, I think, helps explain why there's such vulnerability to fake news, and people seem to tenaciously stick with some very destructive and hurtful religious groups. So here's the essential skill that separates the people who do well from the people who don't, and the skill that all of us need to learn to cultivate. It is the ability to sort through conflicting information and then to be willing to be able to let go of what we've thought, of something that we've believed or been committed to let go of that in light of new information, in light of new insight and new knowledge. Turns out this is not so easy. A couple of years ago, the Scientific American ran an article that profiled some research about why certain people seem more susceptible to fake news than others. Rather than go into the details of how they did this study, I'm just going to include a link below in the notes area and you can read it for yourself. What accounts for that difference? There's like this ability, this willingness that some people have when they receive new information, in light of that new information, to revise their view, right? What seems like a natural thing to do. But there's others that there's this tendency that a lot of people have to be hesitant to change your view of something, change your judgment about something, even when you get new information. So here's the skill, here's the essential task for people today. It's the ability to question what we believe and think about something when we come across information that sheds different light on it. In other words, if we learn something new, assuming that what we learn new is true and accurate and valid, then are we willing to let go of the preconceptions that we have? And for a lot of us, that's really hard. That's one of the reasons why when we make up a certain idea, a certain story in our mind about how something works, about how a person is, or what exactly happened in a certain event, then we learn something that conflicts with the view that we've had. Some of us just want to blow that off. Just forget about it. And we just focus on what we think we already know, even though we're unwilling to look at the facts. This is a tricky subject when it comes to matters of religion and faith. There's a concern about letting go of certain doctrines, certain matters of faith, certain things that we believe. What do you do when you encounter things, when you have experiences in life that really call into question some of the things that you've thought were true in the past, or some of the things that you were taught. Part of how we grow spiritually is we take the things that we've learned, the things that we believe. Let's say as Christians, we believe that the Bible teaches, we were taught that the Bible teaches or whatever. And then as we experience life, we see some of these things that we've thought were true, they don't seem to be making sense anymore. And that becomes a really important part of what I believe is spiritual growth. You know, the Apostle Paul talked about this in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is one of my favorite verses, becoming more and more meaningful to me as life goes on. He says, "When I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, I spoke like a child. But then when I became a man, I put these childish ways behind me." And then he goes on to talk about how right now we know things in part. But then in the future, when the end of time, we will see things. When Christ comes back, we'll know. But right now, there's a lot of things that we only know in part. And so when we're living in that kind of that world or that experience, it only makes sense to be careful about saying, this is what I know is true, and then being closed to the other things that we learn. So another way to think about this is to say that growing in knowledge is not simply a matter of addition. It's not simply racking up more and more information, more and more ideas, more and more knowledge. It's also about subtraction. It's about what we let go of. It's about being willing to discard things that we realize are either no longer true or are really, really uncertain. Two of the people who I think are probably some of the smartest people in the history of the world would be Socrates, the Greek philosopher, and then the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. Socrates, in all of his dialogues that we have recorded, has these exchanges with people where he freely acknowledges that he's not sure, and he sort of pokes holes in the things that other people feel certain about, and he realizes knowledge is recognizing those things are not necessarily true, and he's coming to understand things by recognizing things that he thought were true or other people think are true, but really aren't. Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, talks about how as he has grown, rather than adding more and more, he's learned to let go of more and more. And that is not simply about adding more possessions and letting go of possessions, but it's also as adding ideas or knowledge, but also letting go of ideas and knowledge as he's come to realize that he's no longer certain about them. And part of that growth to maturity is actually a shrinking of the span or the pool of things that he's certain about, because life experience has shown him there's things that he thought were true but really are not. So here's a helpful exercise to do in your spiritual life, especially if you find yourself at points of maybe uncertainty or spiritual disillusionment. Write down on a piece of paper 3 things. So you sort of make a list. It doesn't have to be a long, exhaustive thing. I've done this on a couple of different occasions, and each time it was like less than a page. So the first thing, this is what I'm certain. This is what I believe about God and or about the spiritual life. Okay, that's first part. The second part is, this is what I used to think or was taught to think about God or the spiritual life that I know isn't true. And then the third one, these are the things that I either have believed, been taught to believe about God, spiritual life, that I'm uncertain about, right? So this is what I know for sure, or continue to believe, feel certain about. This is what I know for sure is no longer, I no longer believe now is true. And then third, this is what I used to think is true and now I'm not so sure. here is not to encourage skepticism or to downplay the beliefs of people, discourage beliefs, anything like that. The point is to have an openness and an honesty and a diligent search for truth and an ability to grow in our knowledge by letting go of the things that actually are getting in the way of our real wisdom, getting in the way of us being the people that God wants us to be. So the way that we grow, the way that we learn, the way that we become wise people is not just by accumulating more and more stuff, but it's by having the humility to let go of the things that we recognize are either certainly no longer true or really have some question about them. And then we can face others, face ourselves, and face life with an openness, with an honesty. You can reach me at markbrower.com, my website. There's a contact form there. And I'd love to hear what's happening in your spiritual and intellectual growth.